You are watching a film, and you know with absolute certainty that the protagonist is about to betray everything they claim to believe in. Not because of the plot, because you recognize the archetype they are living. You have seen this pattern before, not in other films, but in the structure of human experience itself. And when the betrayal comes, you are not surprised. You are watching someone else's story and reading it as myth. This is not film criticism. This is how your psyche speaks. This video asks, are you listening? Welcome to Power and Myth. There is something INFJs do that they rarely notice they are doing. They translate experience into story, not metaphorically, not as a creative exercise, as the primary way their consciousness makes sense of the world. You meet someone new, and within minutes, you have intuited not just their personality but their mythic pattern, the hero on a quest who does not yet know what they are seeking, the wounded healer still bleeding from their own unacknowledged trauma, the shapeshifter who wears so many masks they have forgotten which face is theirs. You do not think these things consciously, you know them, and when you try to explain how you know, the language fails, because you are not reading behaviour, you are reading myth. This is the INFJ's particular genius and particular burden. Your psyche does not speak in facts and data. It speaks in archetypes, patterns, symbols and stories that have been repeating since human consciousness first woke to itself. Most people experience life as a series of events. You experience it as a narrative unfolding according to patterns you recognize from fairy tales you read as a child, myths you studied without knowing why they mattered so much, and dreams that felt more real than waking life, and because the culture you live in privileges literal thinking, you have likely spent years wondering if you are reading too much into everything. The answer is no. You are reading correctly. It is simply that you are reading a different text than most people can see. The INFJ psyche is oriented toward the symbolic, the archetypal, the mythic, not as an add-on to normal perception, as the foundational language through which perception occurs. This is not a personality quirk, this is structural, and until you learn to recognize what your psyche is actually telling you when it speaks in myths and symbols, you will feel perpetually misunderstood, even by yourself. Let me show you what I mean. You have a friend who is struggling. They tell you what is wrong, and you listen carefully, but underneath their words you are perceiving something else entirely. You are watching them live out the myth of the exile who believes they do not deserve to return home, or the hero who is refusing the call to adventure, because it would require them to admit the comfortable life they have built is not actually theirs. You do not judge this. You simply see it. And when you try to help, you do not address the surface problem they have named. You address the mythic pattern beneath it. And they look at you strangely because you are speaking to something they did not know they had revealed. This is what it means for the INFJ psyche to speak mythically. You are perpetually in conversation with layers of reality that others do not register. You read people as characters in stories they do not know they are telling. You sense the narrative arc of situations before they have reached their second act. And it exhausts you, because you can never take things at face value. Here is another example. You walk into a room and you feel something immediately, not emotion, a story. You do not yet know whose story it is, but you know its shape. There is betrayal here, or there is grief that has been buried so deeply it has calcified into rage, or there is unspoken love that is destroying two people who will never name it. You have not spoken to anyone. You have not gathered data. You have walked in, and your psyche has read the room mythically, the way someone else might read body language or tone of voice. And later, when the situation plays out exactly as you intuited, no one believes you saw it coming. Because how could you? The rational answer is you could not. The mythic answer is you were listening to the story the room was telling. INFJs are fluent in a language most people do not realize exists, the symbolic language of human experience patterned into myth. This is not magical thinking. This is not pretending life is a fantasy novel. This is recognizing that human beings have been telling the same stories for thousands of years because those stories are maps of psychological truth. The hero's journey is not a narrative structure, it is the shape of individuation. The descent into the underworld is not a metaphor for depression. It is an archetypal pattern that describes what actually happens when the psyche demands you confront what you have been refusing to see. The wounded healer is not a character type, it is the lived experience of those who have transformed their suffering into medicine for others. And the INFJ does not relate to these patterns academically, they recognize them as the very structure of their own experience. You are not reading myths and thinking, that is interesting. You are reading myths and thinking, that is my life. Because it is. Your psyche has been speaking to you in this language since before you had words for it. And if you have spent years feeling like you are too intense, too abstract, too obsessed with meaning, it is because you have been trying to translate mythic consciousness into a culture that demands literal explanation. The problem is not you. The problem is the assumption that everyone experiences reality the same way. So why does the INFJ psyche speak mythically? The answer begins with Jung, though it does not end there. Jung understood that beneath personal consciousness lies the collective unconscious, a shared psychic inheritance containing the archetypes, the primordial patterns that structure human experience across time and culture. The hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother. These are not ideas someone invented, they are the deep grammar of the psyche itself, and whilst every human being has access to the collective unconscious, not everyone is oriented toward it in the same way. An INFJ is. Your dominant function is introverted intuition, which Jung described as perceiving possibilities through the unconscious. But it is more than that. It is perceiving the archetypal patterns that organize those possibilities. You do not just see what might happen, you see the mythic shape of what is already unfolding. And because you have access to this level of perception, your psyche naturally speaks in the language native to it, myth, symbol, archetype, and story. This is not metaphor, this is function. You are wired to perceive reality mythically because myth is the language of the unconscious, and you live closer to the unconscious than most people ever will. But here is where it becomes difficult. You are living in a culture that has largely severed itself from mythic consciousness. The dominant mode of thought is rational, empirical, and literal. Meaning is suspect. Symbolism is decoration, and depth is seen as overthinking. So when you try to explain what you perceive, you are translating from a mythic language into a literal one, and the translation almost always fails. You tell someone, I think they are living out the pattern of the eternal child who refuses to grow into their own authority, and what they hear is, you are making wild psychological assumptions based on nothing. You are not. You are reading the story their behaviour is telling. But because they cannot see what you see, and because you cannot prove mythic perception the way you can prove empirical fact, you learn to stay silent. And the silence compounds. You begin to doubt your own perceptions. You start to wonder if you are projecting, reading too much into things, or making up patterns that aren't there. And slowly, over the years, you stop listening to your psyche when it speaks to you in mythic terms. You dismiss the intuitions. You ignore the symbolic content of your dreams. You tell yourself to be more practical, more grounded, more normal, and in doing so, you cut yourself off from the very source of your deepest knowing. This is the shadow side of mythic consciousness, the isolation, the self-doubt, the exhaustion of living in a world that demands you prove what you perceive when the language of proof is foreign to the territory you are describing. You see someone repeating the same destructive pattern in relationship after relationship, and you recognize it as the myth of the person who believes they do not deserve love, and so sabotages every intimacy before it can reach them. You see it clearly, you try to name it gently, and they become defensive because to them you are making grand pronouncements about their psychology based on insufficient evidence. They do not understand that you are not guessing. You are reading. The story is there, written in behaviour and choice and the particular flavour of their suffering. But because you cannot make them see what you see, you are left holding knowledge you cannot share. And this is the loneliness particular to the INFJ, not the loneliness of being disliked, the loneliness of perceiving dimensions of reality that others cannot access and being unable to bring anyone with you into that perception. There is another shadow here, and it is worth naming. When your psyche speaks mythically, you are always at risk of mistaking the map for the territory. You read someone as living out the archetype of the trickster, and you begin to relate to the archetype rather than the person. You see the pattern so clearly that you stop seeing the individual. This is a real danger. Mythic perception is powerful, but it is not the whole truth. People are always more than the archetypes they are living, and if you are not careful, your gift for reading patterns becomes a way of flattening complexity into story. You stop listening to what people are actually saying because you have already intuited the mythic structure beneath it. You stop being surprised by them, and unsurprisingly, there is no real relationship. This is the shadow of the seer, the moment when seeing becomes a substitute for engaging. When the mythic lens, which should deepen your understanding, instead distances you from the messy, irreducible particularity of another human being. If you recognize this in yourself, know that it is not a failure. It is the inevitable shadow of a profound gift, and the work is not to stop seeing mythically. The work is to hold mythic perception alongside presence, to let the story you are reading inform your understanding without replacing the person standing in front of you. But here is the gift, and it is worth everything. When you learn to trust your psyche's mythic language, when you stop dismissing your perceptions as fanciful and start recognizing them as a legitimate form of knowing, you gain access to a kind of understanding that is unavailable through rational analysis alone. You know when someone is at a threshold because your psyche recognizes the moment from every threshold myth ever told. You know when someone is in their descent because you have read that story 1,000 times in fairy tales and Greek tragedies and your own lived experience. And knowing this allows you to meet people where they actually are, not where they claim to be. It allows you to offer the precise insight they need, even when they did not know they needed it. This is the gift of the INFJ who has learned to listen to their psyche's mythic speech. You become a translator between worlds. You help people see the story they are living, and in seeing it, they gain the agency to choose what happens next. This is not manipulation, this is illumination, and it is what you were built for. So how do you learn to listen? How do you begin to trust that when your psyche hands you a symbol, a dream, a mythic pattern, it is telling you something true? The first step is simple and difficult. Stop apologizing for the way you think. Stop editing your perceptions to make them more palatable to a culture that privileges the literal. When you sense that someone is living out the myth of the wanderer who is searching for home in all the wrong places, trust that. Do not immediately question it. Do not demand empirical proof. Sit with it, see if the pattern holds, and more often than not you will find that it does, because your psyche is not making things up. It is reading the archetypal language that structures human behaviour, and it is fluent in ways that rational analysis will never be. This does not mean you ignore facts. It means you recognise that mythic perception and factual observation are not opposed. They are different modes of knowing, and you have access to both. The work is integration, letting your mythic consciousness inform your understanding without demanding that it justify itself in someone else's language. The second step is to re-engage with the sources that feed mythic consciousness. Reread fairy tales not as children's stories but as maps of psychological initiation. Study mythology not as cultural artifacts but as living descriptions of archetypal experience. Pay attention to your dreams, which are the psyche's most direct mythic communication. Write them down. Sit with them. Ask what story they are telling, because the more you engage with mythic material, the more fluent you become in the language your psyche is already speaking. and fluency brings clarity. You begin to distinguish between genuine mythic perception and projection. You begin to recognize which archetype you are living in any given moment. The hermit when you withdraw, the seeker when restlessness drives you forward, the wounded healer when you are transmuting your own pain into presence for others. And in recognizing the archetype, you gain insight into both its gift and its shadow. You see the pattern you are caught in, and you can choose whether to continue it or to step outside it. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming conscious of the unconscious patterns that run you, so that you can live with intention rather than compulsion. The third step is to find others who speak this language, and they exist. You are part of something here at Power and Myth, a community of those who think mythically, who have always sensed that life is not just a series of random events but a story unfolding according to patterns older than civilization itself. You are not alone in this. Others recognize the archetypal dimensions of experience, who read people as myths, who cannot walk into a room without sensing its narrative structure. And when you find these people, whether here in the comments or elsewhere in your life, the relief is profound, because finally you do not have to translate. You can speak in the language native to your psyche and be understood. This is not tribalism, this is recognition, the kind that allows you to stop hiding the way you actually think. And here is what happens when you learn to listen to your psyche's mythic speech. You stop feeling crazy. You stop second-guessing the intuitions that have always been correct. You begin to trust that when you perceive someone as living out the myth of the person who gives endlessly because they do not believe they deserve to receive, you are seeing something real, and you act accordingly, not by telling them their story, which they may not be ready to hear, but by meeting them with the awareness that comes from understanding the pattern they are caught in. This is how the INFJ becomes the guardian of thresholds, the one who helps others cross from one stage of life to another, simply by seeing where they are and what crossing requires. You do not need to explain how you simply know, and your knowing, when it is trusted, becomes a gift to those who are ready to receive it. If this video felt like finally being given permission to think the way you have always thought, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what is one mythic pattern you have always recognized in others but struggled to name? Which archetype did you see yourself in today? The seer who reads the room as story? The seeker who hungers for meaning? The hermit who withdraws into the inner world where myth lives? You are part of something here. Power and Myth is not just a channel. It is a gathering of those who have always known that life is deeper than the surface, richer than the literal, and structured according to patterns that fairy tales and ancient myths were trying to teach us all along. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring this territory together. Your psyche has been speaking to you mythically your entire life. This is where you learn to listen. Until next time, find your power, know your myth.